Canon Puncture Show, episode 110. Game Advocates, 1001 Nights.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Canon Puncture Show. This is Rich here, and I'm bringing you yet another of our world-famous Game Advocates series. I have the pleasure of bringing on Evan Torner, who's a member of the Western Mass crew and pursuing his PhD candidate in German Studies and Film Studies. Welcome to the show, Evan.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
So Evan, step up. What is this game you want to talk about? Some kind of numbering nights game? That's a Sega game, right?
Unfortunately, it never was a Sega game. It's called 1001 Nights, a game of enticing stories. It's a role-playing game written by Meg Baker, who is the wife of Vincent Baker, whom you may know as the author of Dogs in the Vineyard, Apocalypse World, and Poisoned and In a Wicked Age, both of which I think have been reviewed as game advocates.
Yeah. So we know about some of the games from the husband and this wife. Meg has written something here. Tell me about it. What makes this game different?
What makes 1001 Nights different is that it is probably one of the most comfortable games I've ever played. And I guess comfortable is in two senses. One, that the rules are present, but they're invisible. They just sort of slide off. You realize that they're there as guides, and the story becomes more engrossing than the rules. And the other thing is that when you're running the game properly, you're running it as a dinner party. You're inviting all of your favorite people over, and you're stuffing yourselves full of dates and olives and wine and every possible decadent Middle Eastern treat you can find.
Wait, Middle Eastern? So what's going on? What's this game about?
The game is about a group of courtiers and other people you would find at the Sultan's palace gathering around and telling stories. And these stories involve the other characters who are sitting there at the Sultan's palace. Effectively, you are playing a character who's then, in turn, playing characters in stories. You're role-playing. I can't say it any simpler than that.
Wow. That's pretty crazy. You're role-playing and then you're role-playing characters?
Yeah, but it's not as crazy as it sounds. See, when you're in the game, you kind of make up characters that envy each other, that have these kinds of stewing, angsty conflicts that are brewing under the surface. And that's what we call sort of the deep or the complex story of the character you create at the beginning of the game. What happens then is each character goes in a circle and tells a story. And the stories, by contrast, have to be dirt simple. In fact, that's one main thing I advise you do when you do play the game, to keep them dirt simple. So you say, I'm going to basically play the Arabian Nights version of the Pied Piper of Hamlet. So then I go around the table and I say, okay, you are playing the rats, you're playing the Pied Piper, and you're playing the enraged townsfolk, and you're playing the children. All right, cool. So first of all, the player is not necessarily playing characters, but they're playing some aspect of the story. And that person has total control over that aspect of the story. So then it'll come to the point where the rats are following the Pied Piper, or the mad flutist, or whomever you do it metaphorically in a story, that the rats are following the Pied Piper, and the player in the court says, I've always envied that ring. And so then in the story, the rats go and they bite off the finger of the Pied Piper because they bite off his ring or something like that. You have the deep story of the character you initially create manifest itself in the simple stories that they tell.
Well, that sounds pretty cool and interesting. You got all this Middle Eastern kind of flavor and the food and the storytelling. Well, why wouldn't I just play this with, like, Al-Qadim? Second edition, little D&D second edition Al-Qadim setting, and use that.
Well, it's because your characters in Al-Qadim wouldn't be as awesome as the characters you're playing in 1001 Nights. In Al-Qadim, you would be starting first, second level and have to work your way up, beating off scorpions and that sort of whatever else you find out there in the deserts of advanced Dungeons and Dragons. But 1001 Nights scenario says, well, okay, you're playing like the Sultan's chief. You can play the Sultan's chief vizier. You're like 10 times as powerful as Jafar, and the reason why you can't leave the palace is only because you're still trying to seduce his daughter or something like that. Mm-hmm. The characters you're going to create in this world are going to be, like, by virtue of the system, so much more rich and powerful. Plus, I mean, I've watched people butcher armies. I've watched bloody revenge and assassination and the kind of thing that really gets your adrenaline going in 1001 Nights, though you wouldn't expect it.
I think you've described it a little bit, Evan, but give me a little bit more detail. What are the players actually doing? You mentioned the food and there's some storytelling, but when people sit down to play 1001 Nights, what are they doing?
What are they doing when they sit down? Well, they sit down and they say, we're in a sultan's court. And sometimes your sultan is like a jolly fellow who just loves the fact that all of his assorted servants and courtiers are sitting around telling stories. Or it could be a vicious bastard who, whenever he returns, sends his servants after you with barbed whips. I mean, you kind of create the Sultan's court, and then you create characters who would exist within that Sultan's court. And each of the characters has 5 senses, which are basically their stats. For vision, for example, it's I look pale, or I see the dead, or something to that degree. So you just have a phrase that is associated with those senses. And then after you go around and kind of drive your character and with the flowing fabric and whatnot, and all of this kind of sensuous language, every character that's described is then envied by all the other characters for some reason. So they pick out something. Oh, I envy the way that Emir smells like my father did, and I can never live up to him. Or I envy the fact that the vizier has such a cool-looking coat. Or I envy the prince's lust for the princess. I wish I still had that youthful vigor. So there's a variety of envies. So you're not structured around harmony. You're actually structured by that petty, backbiting court politics that kind of make up our workplace and our lives, but in a fantasy setting.
All right, you convinced me to give this thing a shot. I'm a new player. I have no idea what's going on here. What would you warn me about this game?
I would warn you that if your expectation is to win or to kind of let the forces of fortune along with your talent kind of decide, you're missing the point entirely. For example, the dice mechanic that runs the game is very interesting. Meg calls all the dice gems, and this is deliberately to de-fetishize them. That is to say, to just get us off of the idea that whatever we roll on the die sort of quantitatively matters. So basically, they go odd or even, and either result is interesting for the story. That's it. You don't even have to kind of count numbers for partial successes like you do in Apocalypse World or something like that. So it's brutally simple on the dice level, but if you're the kind of person who really enjoys rolling a 20, it's not for you.
Okay. Well, Evan, describe for me, what are some of your favorite moments at the table during actual games?
I would say that there's a war story my wife has about the game that is absolutely brilliant, so I'm going to tell this one. She ran it at Origins, I think back in 2008. She had a table of excellent players, which is often the case at Origins, and the Sultan was a bloodthirsty and easily bored Sultan, and so one of the players happened to be playing the Sultan's chef, and he was not too careful with his allocation of dice. Rather, there was a scarcity of dice at the table in terms of the mechanics, which meant that he lost the Sultan's favor, and therefore he lost his head. He was beheaded. But the whole time, this scenario, they were looking for an assassin, and this cook had been dropping hints in all of the stories that were told with him in it that he was secretly poisoning the king, or the Sultan, rather. So he was secretly poisoning the Sultan the entire time. He alluded to it in his stories, and when he went to his death, he was like this Guy Fawkes character, where we really identify with his rebellious qualities. There was another time where I ran it where there was kind of a contrast between the story I introduced, where it was very much about the players playing for the forces of darkness themselves and conspiring how they were going to destroy the world. It was a total disaster. No one liked that kind of scenario because it was too open-ended. Uh-huh. But then the very next story, they were like, we are going to play it as Barney, basically. Like, I am the creepy dinosaur who loves all of you. Of course, all the characters themselves have all these envies, and so then they're like, well, what are we? We're playing children, we're being loved by you, and we went crazy. Like, there was this cognitive dissonance there that literally drove, I think, player character and character-like insane as we're trying to grapple with the story. Because, again, he was taking basically the arc of a Barney episode, which is terrifying, and transposing it then to Arabian Nights. It's really strange and fulfilling. It's also the kind of game that you could do that sort of thing with.
That is really bizarre. That's not a hack I would imagine most people would think of. That's Barney. It's great. Well, what do you see other players loving about the game?
Well, what I see them loving about this game is the decadence. The idea that, you're probably eating a lot of food and putting out this lavish tablecloth and dimming the lights, all that kind of mood stuff. Let's say you're just playing this at a con, and you're in a kind of corporate convention center at a generic table. There's still an element of communality. That all of your characters are more or less stuck here at court, and because of that, there is a sense of ritual to the game, sort of a almost primal ritual that gets to the reason why we do role-playing to begin with, is this group storytelling. So that's what people enjoy about the game, and I think it's not just a matter of rules, but a matter of conditioning you in terms of the atmosphere to open yourself up as a player.
Why would people hate this game? You talked about it a little bit when you introduced to a new player, but let's say people have given it a shot and they decide this game isn't for them. Why do they hate the game?
This is a game that doesn't give you a lot of freedom. I mean, there is a game in which you could. I mean, there's mechanisms in the way in which you can fight your way to your freedom, but there aren't a lot of mechanisms that let you say, I'm gonna beat up that PC over there, or I'm going to. I'm just going to leave the Sultan's palace. That player agency is not there. And so when you're talking about player agency, it's always mediated. First, you have to sit there and tell stories until something happens. You have to sit there and tell stories until so it's very structured. And also the stories themselves, if you get stuck with a crappy role, you're not going to have maybe the best of time. Of course, the job of any of the storytellers is to make sure that there aren't a lot of bad parts, or that there is no such thing as a bad part. But, this is also not a game that I would say you can play with people whom you don't trust, I guess, because the characters themselves are all envious of each other and a little nasty, and so it's good to not play it with total strangers. But if the total strangers are mature enough, apparently, like several games we played, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Well, Evan, is there anything else about 1001 Nights that you want to share, or anything we haven't covered?
I think it's one of the most underrated systems of this past decade, actually. In terms of the fact that when I sit down to play it, I'm both playing a role-playing and I'm having a sort of transcendental experience. And that's a very, very mundane sense that, it's not every day that you sit down with your friends with a full banquet prepared. I mean, you really have to invest some time and some effort to get a 1001 Nights game together, and when it happens, then it's like this special party that everybody who's there is taking a part in, and taking a part in actually on 3 different levels: as player character, as character, and as character of a character.
Oh, that is really clever. Evan, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing with us about this game, 1001 Nights.
Thank you, Rich. I really enjoyed being Advocates, and I look forward to listening to more.
We had such potential, such promise, but we squandered our gifts. And so, I am creating you.
Oh yeah. Yeah. To make it pop, dip is up tonight. I'm alright. See the sunlight. Tick tock on the clock, and the party don't stop now. Whoa.
Good one.
That's the end.